Hello, everyone. Welcome tonight to Stratford Hall's virtual program. We're here tonight with Justin Cherry. I am Dr. Kelly Fonto-Dietz. I'm the Director of Collections and Visitor Engagement at Stratford Hall, and I am a passionate foodie, former chef, and someone who loves nothing more than to have people like Justin and others like Dontavius and Nicole Moore and other people as well, Cheney McKnight, come to site and cook in this wonderful kitchen that we have here virtually behind me. We are here tonight with Justin to talk about baked bread, right? Talking about baking during the colonial era and get to watch a video of him actually cooking in our original 1738 brick oven, which is pretty spectacular. Stratford Hall is, I think, a pretty wonderful place. It was established in 1738 by Thomas Lee, and it has a very long and interesting history that we've been talking about through multiple angles. And one of them is food. So this is the first of several programs that we're kicking off again in the next year to come about food at Stratford Hall and colonial foodways and cultural history. So I'm excited here tonight to be with Justin Cherry. So welcome back, Justin.
Thank you very much. Glad to be here. Glad to be
So
here.
I have to, before we get started, before we get this video playing, I want to talk to you a little bit about a couple of things. First of all, I want the audience to understand who you are and why you do what you do. So Justin Cherry, you want to let everyone know sort of how you got into this whole colonial baking thing, and why do you love doing it so much, and what do you do exactly when you're not here at Stratford?
Yeah, so I've been doing living history with my family since I was 4 years old. We belong to a couple different reenacting and living history groups in Pennsylvania, one of them being the William Trent Company, who started the first fort at the forks of the Ohio River near Pittsburgh. And then the other one is a Revolutionary War group called the German Regiment of Washington's Army. So both heavily involved with those groups throughout my childhood and into high school, and then even into college. And then I started cooking as a profession after college. And I moved to 2-3 different places. I worked in Maine, I worked in Italy. I came back and I worked in Charleston at a place called Husk Restaurant. And I started a program there, a baking program. And throughout all this, I've been working with heirloom grains, and I was really missing the weekends of doing living history and educating people and everything that sort of went with it. And so we started a bread program at Husk in the wood-fired oven after Friday and Saturday night service. So we'd clean out the oven, and then we'd shut the door, and I'd come back at like 3:30 in the morning. And I would bake like 6 or 7 loaves of bread using heirloom grains. We work a lot with Anson Mills and Glenn Roberts. So he introduced me to all these grains and like their stories and how they were tied to different places and how sometimes they started here and went somewhere else, and then they came back and they just like evolved into this crazy thing. So I was super into that. And then I sort of thought about like, hey, like what if I can figure out a way to do this and like educate people about the grains and still have the living history aspect of it and like make it a business. So that's kind of what formed Half Crown Bakehouse. And what it allows me to do is travel around pretty much the East Coast, up and down. I do about 20 events or so a year. I work with different historic sites like Stratford Hall and Mount Vernon and Washington Crossing Park in Pennsylvania, Fort Ligonier in Western Pennsylvania. So I do programs there as well as sell during like big events and things like that. And during the week and during the off season, which there really is no real off season, I do research, historic research about the grains and kind of about the times and going through text and all that kind of stuff. And that's what sort of fills my time. I do farmers markets, still 18th century baked goods and everything out of the oven. So that really doesn't change. It's just a different atmosphere. Instead of being surrounded at a historic site or historic dressed people, it's a modern day farmers market.
Yeah, and your oven is quite phenomenal that you drag around in the back of your truck, I have to say. I wish we had a picture of it right now for you all to understand what a beast this thing is. And you didn't make that, right? You had it
So
made
I
by
designed
somebody?
it. Yeah, I
Okay.
designed it, and then it's designed after a oven that was described in the 19th century by somebody that still saw an oven standing in where the Salzburgers came northwest of Savannah, Georgia, and built a couple grist mills, and they also built 4 or 5 of these ovens. And there's a gentleman like that described one in the 19th century that it was still standing, and it was kind of the dimensions of what my oven is. It's about almost 5 foot deep, 4 foot wide, built up of wood and clay and stone. But my oven is really nothing compared to the oven at Stratford Hall, which my oven could probably fit inside of that oven, and it looks like a little miniature easy bake oven compared
So
to
I always wanted one of those easy bake ovens when I was little, and my mom was like, "Oh, it'll burn the house down." And I still have this weird want to have one of those little weird, light bulb heated,
yeah.
nasty little brownie cake things. Yeah. Anyways, if you're ever looking for a present to get me, Justin, give me an easy bake oven and I'll be happy. But that brings us to Stratford Hall and sort of thinking about the ways in which our oven was used. So you came a few months ago. I can't remember when it was. Sort of
It was
check out the
March,
oven.
I think.
March, so almost a year ago, you came out. So Justin came out to Stratford, and you'd done foodways programs before, and you brought your big oven out. And the oven in the hearth here, which this is reversed, but it's sort of right where my finger is pointing. So like right in there. I don't think it had been opened up and used in probably about 100 years. And it's the original 18th century oven. And I always wanted, Justin to come out and just give it a test drive. What was it like opening that thing up?
Well, first of all, there was enough crickets and spiders inside of that thing to fill up a number 5 brown paper bag.
I
And
still ate the bread that came out of there.
it's okay. Everything got cleaned out. But you really don't know how big it is until you like light the fire and see how big it is, because it's because it's kind of into the side when most hearths lie in the center, and then the oven is usually to the right or to the left of it, and it sort of feeds into that hearth. But this one is actually into the side of the wall, so the left side is a lot larger than the right side. It kind of bows out into like a small letter, like almost like a P, like a letter P on that one side. It kind of peels out. And the height of it, the sheer height of it is what, usually gets me. And, we were trying to figure out like how they would use this oven, because you can't use it like most ovens when you clean it out and sweep it and you mop it and you kind of fire the bread on the deck. I mean, they'd have to be sitting up on something like, like a tin baking sheet or tin baking tray. They'd have to be up, because the amount of heat, it takes 7.5 hours, to get this thing fired up from like cold. The next day, when you figure that this was never getting cold, it'd always be fed back and forth from, embers and ashes from the hearth into the oven and back and forth. And, I don't think they ever really cleaned out the hot coals at all. I think they
Mhm.
just, took out the ones that they needed to, kind of remain heated enough for whatever you were doing in there. And then you just, I don't even think they closed the door half the time.
That
If they
makes
did, it was
sense.
probably,
They ate so much bread back then. Every
yeah.
record I've seen, it's like just people eating biscuits and bread with every single bit of their meal.
Yeah, and I think the way that oven sits is like you could shove the fire and the coals all the way to the right and bake on the left hand bowed side of it, and kind of shove it in the back and almost like cock the door, so it's like not fully shut, but it still has enough oxygen to kind of come in and out.
Yeah.
But no, it's, and the dome itself, I mean, it's almost 4 feet tall. If that's in comparison, usually your door is half the height of your oven dome, which that kind of rings true. And it's just the architecture and engineering of ovens, of that time. Not even of that place, because it was going around all over the world, those kind of ovens. But the way that that's built is just, got an extremely large dome, and it's like you really don't know. It's like how many things at a time were they cooking?
Yeah.
Because you have this giant hearth sitting to your left that
I,
has,
the
a
hearth
spit.
is gigantic. I
Yeah,
really, as a specialist on historic kitchens, I've seen very few hearths this large
yeah,
and none that I can think of in the original colonies at all. It's gigantic.
yeah. It's just huge. So you have multiple facets of cooking. Probably the most extreme, like, you know, kitchen set of a kitchen gear. I mean, like, look at the spit and look at everything on there, and it's just like, yeah, it's massive. It's incredible. So you imagine the parties and the feasts that they were giving from the amount of things that were being cooked. That's why that oven is so big. That's why that hearth is so big.
Yeah, it's really fascinating. And one of the things before I show the video and sort of pivot towards the more sort of, sort of visual parts of this show tonight, I do want to sort of talk about the tall, like the height of the rolls that you made. Do you remember those? Those were wild. You made a
Oh yeah.
roll, right, that you've made in other ovens. And
Yeah.
what did it look like when you baked it in this beast of an oven?
Yeah, when I usually bake it before, it only goes as far as, the pan that it's in or the baking sheet that it's on. But like because of the height of this oven and the heat rising of it, it just took these rolls. I mean, I think when they went in, they were like, I don't know, 2 inches high, 2.5 inches high. When I brought them out, they were like six. They
They
had,
were huge. They
yeah,
looked
they
like
had
little
double.
skyscrapers. I've never seen a
Oh
roll
yeah.
taller than it is wide before until
Oh
you
yeah.
baked in this
Crazy.
oven.
No, it was insane. And the heat that it gives off too, like the amount of cooking time on stuff, it's just, I'm not going to say it's more efficient, but
Yeah.
you have it completely filled up. Yes, it's efficient because you're cooking a massive amount of food, that's getting maximum heat where it belongs. So it's wild,
It's
crazy.
so interesting. And I love to sort of recreating, using these original ovens, using these original
Yep.
like pans and pots and recipes.
Yep.
You're really able to recreate the kinds of literal food that people were eating and cooking.
Yeah.
And so when we saw those weird tower buns, if you want to call them that,
Yeah.
thinking about like what would have been like for someone like Richard Minot, who was the indentured, cook there, or the enslaved chef Caesar, to like
Mhm.
be in there trying to cook these rolls and they're coming out tall. And then if you were a guest of the Lees, you're used to eating these normal little biscuits and you show up and you've got this like tower
Yeah.
and you're like, what are you all doing over here? So I can imagine there was probably some chatter about the tall bread at the Lees. I don't know.
Oh
I
yeah.
find it fascinating.
Yeah, I think you're exactly right. I think that might have been part of the benefit of dining with the Lees, was just to experience like this incredible food and like, kind of adaptive style. Because at the time, I mean, when you look at the Northern Neck, I mean, literally in the 1720s, 30s, and 40s, and even the 1750s, that's the center of where everybody, everybody knows your name. It's like Cheers, everybody got together and everybody literally knows your name. And, there were these vast meetings and feasts, and it's where everything started to talk about expansion west, to talk about expansion north. I said these were the people that were making decisions that would actually impact things further down the road. So if you think about that and then think about the people that ate here, like
Yes. And the
the amount of,
conversations that happen, and
yes,
food
yeah.
is all so much a part of that,
Oh yeah.
right?
Yeah. Just fantastic. Yeah.
I love it. All right. Well, on that wonderful note, and just so you all know as well, so Justin's got a two-part program here, getting everybody ready for the holidays. And tonight we're going to be talking about bread, and next Tuesday we'll be talking about savory pies. So definitely tune in for that. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen and show a video, which is very normal for us here at Stratford to have a nice curated little video to show you Justin Cherry in action. So give me one moment here and I'll get this started for everyone. All right.
Hello, my name is Justin Cherry, and welcome to Stratford Hall Kitchens, where today we'll be exploring the 1738 original bake oven, and we'll be baking up some bread used from grains that were grown on the property in the 18th century by the Lees. So behind me lies the hearth at Stratford Kitchen, along with the bake oven, which is positioned in the far left corner. And this bake oven is probably one of the largest in the colonies at the time, if not the largest throughout most of the 18th century. It's about 6 foot deep, about 4.5 feet at its widest point, and from the bottom of the floor of the oven to the top, it rises almost 4 feet. All right, so in front of us we have our dough trough, which previously was filled with water that was heated in the oven, and then we'll top it with a little bit of barm, which was the top of what came from brewing beer and distilling. So they would scrape that off, and it would either be used in liquid form or they would dry it off and use it as a yeast. So the ale yeast, which we've used today, sits in the water for just a bit, 8 to 10 minutes, and then we slowly work our flour in there. And the grains that we have today, that were grains that were usually grown on the estate then, which were spelt, wheat, and corn. And there's documentation of these crops being grown there. And also the grist mill on site down by the Potomac would have milled these grains. And a certain allotment would have been allowed for the household use. So we have our dough now, which is in the second or third stage of mixing, and then we'll begin to fold the dough after it's mixed together. So what we're going to do is we're going to take our bread dough that has just kind of caught a shape after about 5 minutes, and we're going to flip it over inside of this three-legged, also original pan of the 18th century. And why we're doing that is the oven is very large and very tall, so all the heat is going to be attracted more towards the top. So we want to use something up off the deck. So we're going to take the dough and we're going to flip it right over. We're going to dust a little bit of flour on the bottom. And then we're just going to sort of pat it down, just a touch, just to let it kind of spread out on its own. And then we're going to slit the top of it. This allows gas and air to escape, so there won't be sides of the loaf blown out. All right, so now we have our bread that is in our three-legged pan, And we also have the cross-cut in it to let out any gases when it hits the actual oven heat. And we're going to pop it in our oven now. All right, so we have our bread that we've moved out of the pan onto the deck just to get a little bottom heat on it. And we're going to take that out of the oven now. It's been about 40 minutes or so, and we should be good to go. All right, looks beautiful. All right, we'd like to thank you for joining us at Stratford Hall in the original bake oven where we baked this beautiful loaf. And now we're going to enjoy it as we cut in and see what it looks like. Forms quite a crust in that oven. But here we are, look at this loaf made of spelt, corn, and wheat. Looks great, can be enjoyed with some apple butter, maybe the original Lee recipe from the 1780s, or some butter and cheese.
Now I'm hungry. Thanks, Justin.
Sorry.
Oh, goodness. So good. Okay. So we're going to jump right into the Q&A. I just have to say, I ate that bread and it was quite fantastic. And you mentioned the apple butter, the Richard Henry Lee recipe that you found. Where did you find that again?
It was in his memorandum book. I think
Okay.
it was 1784, 1785. But yeah, it's like ridiculously easy. I mean, they don't change much except, today we like to put a lot of sugar and cinnamon and other things
Yeah.
in there. And back then it was basically just apples stewed with new cider and allspice. And that's it.
I have to say it's really incredible. I still prefer that butter that you make to anything. But all right, let's go ahead and get into these Q&As here. Welcome back, Cynthia. So Cynthia says hello, and hello back at you. It's great to have you back on. You're a huge supporter of our foodways programs. She asks, speaking of table conversations, what is the most memorable conversation about which you have read in letters or other written material, a conversation that took place during a meal at Stratford Hall? Thank you. I have a story about an enslaved manservant / waiter named Sonny, which is quite hilarious. It has nothing to do with the food, but more about how he was resisting and wanting to upset his enslaver, Philip Ludwell Lee, who we all sort of chuckle about around here because he's quite a character in history. But I can't think of anything in particular about Stratford and the meals. I know the Lees ate literally like kings and queens. I mean, the hearth itself speaks to the amount of food that they were eating and the kinds of food they were eating. Absolutely. Anything you have to add to that, Justin?
I don't think you always, as like historians, I think we always wish there was more people wrote about, but
right.
I don't know if it was honestly just sometimes a matter of people didn't want to talk about things that they did during eating, like during
right.
I don't know if they thought it was rude or, you always hear some like funny anecdotes that happened outside of the actual meal itself that might have actually the meal, but never like, oh yeah, remember last Tuesday when we were eating that roast goose? Like you hope to read that someday, but like it really never happens.
Yeah. Maybe one day we'll find some really juicy letters somewhere. But yeah, great question, Cynthia. And there was another one that came in during the video that I want to make sure everybody heard. So I'm looking at the Q&A here. So Cynthia also asked, How might tools and equipment, as well as recipes, have advanced? Great question. During the 18th century, and on what? And on what are some of these advances based, other than progress with technology? So, Justin, you definitely answered this here in the typed version of the Q&A, but talk a little bit about the advances in equipment during this period, please.
Yeah, so there wasn't too much involved with advances that much from like the 16th, 17th, and 18th century. But if we're jumping from like 18th to modern day, I mean, some of this equipment definitely stayed the same. It was just little tweaks and hints, like um, I was telling Cynthia that the bench knife, the bench scraper that I was using in the video, that literally has not changed in like 300 years, or pretty much longer. It's kept the same shape. I mean, probably
It works.
the material has changed. Now we have stainless steel ones. Back then they were, made of iron. So it definitely changed a little bit in material, but the design itself has not changed. I mean, even if you look at Stratford's kitchen in general, I mean, look at the rotisserie. I mean, look at the rotisserie. I mean, it's like, this is how, restaurants made their millions by, roasting a bunch of chickens at one time.
Right.
It hasn't changed. Even look at the like bread peel that I took that out of, that has not changed too much. It's literally a carved crude piece of wood, and it's gone from that to now when we think of a peel, we automatically think of pizza, no matter what it's used for. It's like, oh, that's what they take pizzas out for. And it's like, no, it was definitely bread before pizza, not the other way around. But it is interesting, and cultural influences had a lot to do with that too. With different ironworks and different cultures involving different technologies. I think the 18th century was a good point where all those kind of converged a little bit, and they made things that worked, so we didn't change them that much.
No, and Justin has a killer selection of equipment too that he brings to these sites, and we're in the progress of growing Stratford's collection of things, so anyone can walk in and make anything you want. So awesome question, Cynthia. Thank you for that. We have a question from an anonymous attendee. Did brewers and bakers work closely together? Love that question.
Oh yeah, they were like best friends.
I can imagine, right?
Between brewers, bakers, distillers, and millers, it's all of that stuff is almost the same kind of process. And the fact that bakers would get barm from the brewers to serve as the yeast or leavening agent in the bread, it delved them even more closely. And the fact that all of them both worked with millers, because you need grains for bread, you need grains for beer, you need grains for whiskey, you need grains for pretty much everything.
For life.
Yeah. So all those things, that now we kind of take for granted because, maybe one person does all of those jobs. But back then they were all separate trades, and they develop relationships, which we don't see very often anymore, between that, because now they're all usually the same person. So that's something that, we shouldn't kind of take for granted now, that the fact that we do everything, but the fact that, that might be somebody else's job too.
That's true. That is true. Doreen asks, great question. How was the leftover bread used?
Yeah, so that's an awesome question. So usually leftover bread and or the top of bread, like the crust of bread was, there was this tool that you don't see them anymore. It's called a bread rasp, and it looks kind of like a chisel almost, and it's wrapped ergonomically like around the knuckles. Picture like a tool, an iron tool wrapped around the knuckles, that the handle is actually, you hold like this and it's wrapped around here, and it looks like a little mini like cheese grater almost. And then you rasp the bread. So rasping the bread would take off that crust on the top, and it would kind of expose the soft bread. But you would use those raspings of bread in puddings You'd use to thicken soups and stews, and you'd kind of use it to your advantage, almost like crumbled bread. I don't want to say like stuffing, but it's used as a thickener. So, if there was leftover bread, it would be used, and sometimes you would make bread just so you could make that stuff on top of that.
I love it. I love it. And that bread that you made too had such a beautiful crust on it.
Yeah.
So Ruth asks, "Hi Justin, Cynthia, how long did you let the dough rise in the basket prior to placing it in the oven?" If you could actually walk us through, there's another question too about the
Yeah.
proportions. So walk us through the recipe that you just made. So I love the fact that it had 3 different grains in it. Walk us through the proportions, the measurements, sort
Yeah.
of like where that recipe came from, that whole thing.
Yep. So the receipt itself is more of a ratio on what Colonial bread was like. What the hydration level was like, being more grain per water. So like today, when you pay for bread, you're paying for a lot of air. So this bread is between 45 and 55 percent hydration. So all that means is that you're getting more actual grain for what you eat. So it's a little more dense, and it's a little more harder to work with, so to speak. And kind of talking about the grains, the fact that there is, and I did this bread on purpose to kind of highlight household uses of some of the grains of the Lees at Stratford Hall, because they grew wheat there, they grew corn there, and they grew spelt. There's records of bushels and bushels of spelt being carried, bushels and bushels of wheat, and the same with corn. So in that thought, I made this bread to kind of use it as a vehicle to explain what they were growing and what they would set aside for like household use, and not so much for selling to others, because they do have a mill on property. So what they weren't selling to others, or what they weren't using themselves, that sort of set aside. So the whole process of that you sort of missed when the video came in, was there's about 2 quarts of water or so, and then there's about 4 quarts of that mix of flour, and the percentage is about 30% to 50%. So 20% corn, there's 50% wheat, and then the rest of the percentage is the spelt. And that first flour that you see, the white Lamasse, that's a soft that's a soft wheat, a soft white wheat, but it is bread strength. So you just have to work it a little longer. And that is a sifted flour. The cornmeal itself is also, it's pretty finely, it's not coarsely ground. And the spelt is completely ground and very, very not sifted at all. If there's any bran, it's probably like 2% bran that got sifted out of that. It's just because the spelt was ground and the white Lamasse were both ground at at Mount Vernon using their traditional water wheel mill. So in combination of those grains, that goes into the actual water after the ale yeast was added, and it gets mixed in till it sort of hits a more of a feel for me. There's not so much a straight receipt that I use when I stop, because obviously, humidity and kitchen conditions, they change. I mean, I'm sure that they changed every single day. It was particularly a little bit cold in the mornings when we were there. So, that had to be kind of made up for. Humidity was about 0. So that really didn't have any effect on it. So it's just mixed until it's kind of pliable so I can work with it. And also just to get up to that percentage of the 18th century. So like that, that 50%. So it's like, it's rather dense. And then when it actually, it sat in there for about an hour and a half or so. And it kind of fermented. and it rose a couple times and it got folded over.
It smelled
And then
so good.
like
Mm.
right before it hit the basket, it only hits that basket really just to like catch a shape, like it said, like, in 5 minutes. That's only because it was cold in that kitchen. And it just took a while for that to get there. Um, so it only really sits in there to catch a shape. So when you flip it over, it's not, and you could form the shape with your hands. I could have easily done that and like plopped it into the pan that I was baking it in. But just to make sure it has a little bit more of, a shape. So when it hits there, it doesn't like overform and doesn't crowd the pan that it's going into. So that's pretty much the process. I mean, it's very easy to like sit here for 5 or 6 minutes and talk about it, but to kind of see the process itself is, it's like a 3.5, 4 hour process. And if you're starting that oven from cold and it takes 7 hours to do it, you need to time out when you're mixing your dough to when that oven is hot. But like we said before, the oven was probably never cold. So, they're definitely mixing earlier in the morning. They probably had rolled over dough from the previous day and, in that bread box. And they probably moved it closer towards the fire towards the end of the night so that could, catch a little bit of a proof overnight. So all these things sort of go into it, and you can really develop a sense of what was going on. And this is a busy kitchen. It's not
Yeah.
some place that like, oh, 5 o'clock, let's shut it down. It's
Yeah.
always going. So, that kind of makes you think about who was in there and what they were doing and how they were doing it.
And
And
balancing all of that with
yeah,
all the other dishes that they were making,
yep.
etc. I mean, yeah, incredible work went on in that space. Where was the yeast stored on a plantation like Stratford? Another question we got here
So,
that's related.
the thing is, we haven't we haven't really uncovered that. I haven't seen any documentation of that. So more than likely, if they were brewing, which I believe they were, even if they were doing cider work and distilling small batches like
Mhm.
that, they would have barm, they would have that, or they would just roll over and make a crude sponge with some of that. So that's they're really not near anything at that period in time.
Mhm.
Stratford, as is in modern day, it's not by any major booming cities, so it's not like they could go to a brewer and be like, hey, more than likely there was in the Fredericksburg area, there was a ton of brewers, and there was that exchange. So there might have been that occasional trip into town to get something fixed that they couldn't fix there. So that could have all been picked up, and I haven't seen anything in financial records of any yeast being bought or barm being bought. So it's like one of those great mysteries until it's either nobody wrote about it yet or we just haven't found it yet.
Great question, though, definitely.
Yeah.
All right, we have another question here from an anonymous attendee. Do you have a favorite recipe from a historic site or historic receipt book?
Mm. It's funny because until I stumbled along the apple butter recipe, I hadn't seen one like in English. Um, I hadn't seen one in English, and if it was a little bit later. It was maybe 19th century. Um, it's just one of those things that it's like you're hoping to find because it's like, man, I really hope apple butter existed because it did. It did in various formats. Sometimes it was called like black butter or Pennsylvania Dutch. They call it a few other things, and it's just one of those things. And it's just like, it was so weird because when I saw it, because I was going through the memorandum book and I was just like, huh, there's apple butter. And I was like, this is so great. And the fact that it's like, it's so simple.
Right. And so good.
It's just so simple. And I mean, it sounds simple because there's like very few ingredients, but um, it's, it's just phenomenal because you figure how long they were cooking that like over the hearth. Like
Mhm.
how long did that take to get the very small amount that they were, it was probably a larger amount, but once you reduce all those things down, it's not much.
Yeah.
It's not like it could, but it was enjoyed, on a time where you couldn't enjoy apples. That's what it was meant to be,
Right, for later.
take it and make it, and it was a preservation technique that was awesome. Just great. Yeah, it's one of my favorites.
It is really good. Another great question from an anonymous attendee. What kind of bread were the enslaved eating and making? They were making all of the bread. So they were making all the fancy stuff. They were making all the everyday stuff, the biscuits, etc. And as far as eating goes, you can add to this too, Justin, but they had their own sort of things that they were eating as well. Things like hoe cakes they were literally making on the open hearth as they were having to cook for, the big house and the white folks that lived in the big house and all their guests. They were making little things and everything from that to like things like cornbread and hush puppies. Like you have evidence of that as well. Do you have any other sort of tidbits you want to add to that, Justin?
I mean, the amount of things that came from corn and like other ingredients like that is, because people say, oh, like, what do you make from corn? They're like, oh, cornbread or like hoe cakes. And it's like, but the thing is like, those were the driving foods on what, a nation was built on, both indigenous people and, and enslaved workers. Because if you don't have corn, then you don't really have a lot of things being made. And honestly, that was the main crop. You got tobacco and you got corn, and then after corn there was like wheat. So like you needed those things to move forward and progress. And I think as everybody sort of moved on, corn was still a staple. Corn was a staple from a
Still
lot.
is a staple,
Still is
right?
a staple. So it
Yeah.
actually never left. So it's, there's a ton of things you can make from corn. And also the amount of varieties of corn is like astounding. If you compare it to like varieties of wheat and varieties of everything else, I mean, when there's 10,000 plus varieties of corn,
Wild.
and all of those being spread, throughout North America, already indigenous to Central America and being spread even before the colonial period, you sort of see some of these start and then actually go to West Africa, back, get improved, and then come back over here, being even better, a little more nutritious, a little more better selected. It's crazy.
What's that? You made a Carolina rice bread when you were here once. That was fantastic.
Yep.
And when I think of rice, of course, I think of West Africa. I think of the Mende people. I think of the
Yep.
rice coast, that you see in Georgia and the Sea Islands. What is that recipe real quick? Because that is a phenomenal bread that you made before.
Yeah. So it's, more than likely, rice breads were, 250 years, 260 years plus. Somewhere in between, not so much a yeasted bread, what we think of, more of like, probably it was first identified as like an unleavened bread,
Okay.
which not so much Carolina gold rice was used, but other varieties brought from West Africa mixed in with varieties that got brought from Italy that were brought over here by Italians, but then grown by African Americans. And all those bits and pieces, that's where you see like the rice grits come into play. And that's like what I use
Yeah.
are the rice grits, like the hand impounded bits that get cooked and combined with, a mixture of wheat and barley, things that were both grown on the Sea Islands. So those things together, baked, just make an outstanding bread. Like I don't think it was, I think when we think of food and when we make food today, we're curating flavors to our tastes. Now, I'm not going to say it tasted the same back then, but if it did, it's like you're getting all like the nutrition, you're getting all of the nutrients and proteins from all those things, and it's just an amazing bread that sort of was built by both mix of where they were and where it came from. So the
Yeah,
Sea
it's
Island is like,
fantastic.
yeah, the culture of that is, yeah, very outstanding.
Really, really cool. Got a great question here from Ruth. Hi, Justin. Have you ever tried to bake decoratively shaped breads like these ones from a bit earlier? I will share my screen momentarily to show you what she's talking here. Very classic. Come on, there. Not showing. This is great. Give me a second here. It pulled up a minute ago. My internet is slow. This is really dramatic.
I can't wait to see it.
Yeah. All righty then. Well, oh yes, how exciting. Here we go. All right, come on, internet. It's like little elves like churning the like internet wires in the background. All right, I'm gonna give it like 5 more seconds and I'm gonna call it a quit here. All right, so basically it was a picture. I'll just describe it because you have to be able to. It's a picture of like the braided breads that you see in these like wonderful medieval paintings from Europe.
Oh yeah,
Did
yeah.
you ever do those?
Yeah, I've seen this picture before. I I have made some of those. You've seen the background above there. There's rolls behind him, and then there's pretzels up to his right. You know, I try to. I don't want to say I try to curate, but I try to curate breads that kind of fit into the place that I'm at. And I don't know if I've actually been to a place where those were like very where they fit in, I guess is what I'm trying to
Yeah.
say. Like pretzels and that kind of thing. I haven't really, you know, been to a place where I've actually tried to do that, because most of the time when I'm on the road, some of these are, military events, whether it be French and Indian War or Revolutionary War, and
Right.
something where like, soft bread was only made for officers. So like what I always make would only be eaten by officers. If not, they would have like ship's biscuits, and or hard bread, which could be made a lot in the ovens. You could fit a lot of those compared to like a soft loaf of bread, and or bigger loaves of bread that would be for 6 days at a time. So no, I haven't quite made those yet, but they actually, I've made a few of them at some of the markets, and like coming up like Christmas markets and things like that.
Yeah, they're very, festive looking, right?
Yeah, they're a little bit more fit that kind of persona. But that's a good question, because every kind of bread sort of has its place and class and time, and military, civilian, that kind of thing.
I love it. I love it.
Yeah,
There's a question from Jeff, talking about the sort of rest in the basket. Is this a documented technique with the bread, or is that like a Justin Cherry special?
Yeah, it's sort of a thing that was somewhat created by me, just because the timing of my oven and the timing of this oven as well. It really depends the situation, but honestly, for me, it's always worked best if it has that short rest period, like of literally, just because normally when I'm baking out of my oven, it's 20 to 27 loaves at a time. So by the time I start shaping and flipping into the banneton, to the baskets, by the time I get to number 27, they're ready to go.
Yeah.
They're ready to go in the oven. And, because usually, it's warmer weather. I mean, we're in South Carolina, because my time is a lot shorter here too. So it's like, you need to be ready to move. And also, I think to an extent, wood-fired ovens, as much as you'd like to think you're in control, you're not. You're not. You're on its time, and I'm sure this one was run that same exact way throughout, Richard Minot and throughout Caesar's time. Like, it was that timing, like you're on its time. So like, and that makes it rough, because when you think about it, there's somebody else that's demanding food at a certain time. So you're not on your own time, even though the oven's on your time. You're like, there's so many people involved at that point that it's like, this needs to be done at a certain time. So, okay, so that oven had to be worked so hard
Gotta
that
learn it.
they probably knew it so well that you could do it blindfolded,
Yeah.
because there's actually no room for error in that, and neither the hearth either. It's not like today, like, hey, if you burn something, like, oh,
Yeah.
we'll just chuck it in the coals, nobody will find out. Like, that's not a thing. And the same way with, burning bread or undercooked bread or something like that.
Yeah.
It's not, it probably was definitely not an acceptable thing. And that makes you learn that skill even better.
And it's funny too, because I try to stay away from just ovens generally. Like I'm a big, I don't bake. I mean, I respect anyone who bakes, but it's such a sensitive process that I can't even imagine having to be working in that kitchen, like right as an enslaved person, or
Yeah.
even Richard Minot, sort of dealing with the pressure that came with having to temper
Yeah.
that whole relationship with that big oven. We have a great question here from Cynthia, which kind of feeds into another question that I had, and I'll combine them. So she says, hello again. To what extent did bakers borrow recipes and adjust from the old country? And she was saying that she saw some gingerbread cookies from a Prague bakery that looked very similar to Colonial version. So my question that I wanted to ask as well is thinking about, and I love thinking about mapping of cultures and sort of the ways in which, even in, especially in Caribbean cuisine, right? And you think about the different colonizers and different groups of enslaved people and where they all came from and how that influenced the cuisine. When you look at colonial America, when you look at those original colonies, what do you see in terms of like the German influence, the French influence, the British influence, the African influence, sort of what did that do to bread or baked goods generally? Do you want to just kind of like lay that out a little bit and sort of talk
Yeah.
about the different
I think
flavors that you find in different regions?
it's probably easier to talk about baked goods in general, because then it's sort of because bread is tough, because
Just do baked goods. You're good.
every culture has some type of bread. But baked goods in general, for somewhat you can follow recipes, but then I also think that I have a certain kind of opinion about 18th century cookbooks and receipt books that, there's so much plagiarizing going on in the 18th century, like ridiculous. It's like, Sally copied Robbie, and Robbie copied Tommy, and Tommy copied, Bobby. And it's like, the farther back you go, it's actually the better. But then it's like, well, what was that from? Where did they get that? And who is actually reading these in 18th century America? Like, who is actually and did they buy these like somewhat we buy coffee table cookbooks today? Like, it's
Right, because there's so many more, and I know this from my own work, there's so many more unpublished cookbooks that you see in all these historical societies. I mean, there's hundreds of them, and there's only a handful of published ones. And so, what does that say about the authorship and authority of these colonial recipes?
And it's like people that were teaching classes, like there's and folks that sign up for the next class, they'll learn a little bit about Edward Kidder. I'm not going to talk too much about him. You have to learn about him the next one. But Edward Kidder was a teacher in London of cookery, mainly pastries, fine pastries and breads. And he had his students copy. His students actually got a blank copy of a book with his picture on it, and then they would fill it out as he explained it. So then they would take that, and I wonder how many of them published later on, because it would say for the use of his scholars. It's like, well, nobody kept that book and just like went home with it and didn't show it to anybody.
Right.
And, a couple other people, they wrote down things. And so that's just one culture. That's just in England. Think about what happened in Germany. Think about what happened, in Austria-Hungary, about all those places. It probably happened a lot. And then you come to, 18th century colonial America, And here we have all these people with large scale plantations that the people that own the plantations are not doing the cooking. So they're the ones that own the cookbooks. And how is that piece of that puzzle put together between, the people that are actually doing the cooking in the kitchens and those cookbooks with all of those recipes that's mainly British food and or some German mix, maybe some French influence. And how did that evolve from that to what West Africans are bringing over for what they're cooking for themselves, and how is that food compared to, say, what's in this cookbook?
Yeah.
And flavors combined, I bet you could take a couple things from the British cookbook and add some spices from this culture, and then next thing you know, you have like this great American cuisine.
Yeah.
It's,
Exactly.
it's kind of that way. But in speaking about bread and wheat and baked goods, you can also talk about the grain, because if you follow the grain, then you'll sort of follow the flavor and the manner in which things are made. So one culture, say for gingerbread, one culture might use straight wheat, maybe some spelt, maybe some einkorn, and then maybe later on they just use straight wheat, or maybe they use rye because that's what they had. So all those grains, they actually inflict more flavor than actual sugar, which was highly expensive, but traded very often and throughout the colonies. And if you want a great sugar, you can listen to Kelly Fonto Dietz's sugar talk on
Audible. Yeah.
on Audible. If you want to learn about sugar and why things like that weren't so common weren't so sweet sometimes, because sugar was expensive. And
how sugar changed everything, basically.
Yeah, it changed everything. So, and speaking about that, it's the colonial period of, baking was heavily influenced by a bunch of different cultures, a bunch of different grains, coming from different areas of colonial North America. I mean, before you had grains in the South, they were coming from, Pennsylvania and Virginia. And before there was Virginia grains, there was New England grains, because those are what sort of started everything. And those were being shipped into Philadelphia. And, until you get into pushing further west, you don't get a lot of people's own land growing their own wheat, until you look at those backcountry places in Western Pennsylvania and even Western Virginia, when it was still part of Virginia, not, West Virginia. And when you start looking at those, then you can see people that are actually, they're just trying to survive. They're not so much cooking for flavor, and not many people were. And there's a big difference between, commercial bakehouses and, places like Stratford Hall, and then a backcountry home and, backcountry South Carolina. There's a lot of differences, but you will see a lot of similarities in certain places, just because one thing got passed to another, and you can kind of relate them all to one thing or another.
That's very true. And Kathleen just said, great explanation. Women learn to bake and cook from their mother and or a grandmother. Like today, recipes are tweaked to personal taste. So over the years, variations of recipes appear. Ingredients change based on availability, and it's a fascinating area of study. I think Justin and I completely agree with that assessment, Kathleen. We have no more questions in the Q&A box here. I'm going to give a last call for questions here tonight for Justin Cherry. We are excited about, again, launching this sort of next round of foodways programs. We've got Justin's next program on savory pies on Tuesday, a week from today. And then on December 7th, we'll be doing another chocolate program, which I'm pretty excited about as well. But I have to say, having that kitchen fired up and having Dontavius and yourself and Nicole Moore and Cheney McKnight come out and work in that space and give that space and that kitchen life again has been absolutely phenomenal. And I mean, we have staff here on site that have worked here for decades, and they have finally felt like, we're gaining a seat at the table, for lack of a better phrase, and talking about food and American history and the importance of all of this. So Justin, it's always wonderful having you here at Stratford to bake, and also to have you on these virtual programs that we offer. We've got one question here. Oh, Kathleen, great presentation. Thank you. Yes, one day we need to see Justin's beast. I agree. So yeah, Justin's oven is absolutely insane. And I think we'll probably plan some programs maybe next year sometime where you can bring your oven out and give it a run at Stratford. But for this program in particular, we definitely loved having you bake in our oven, Justin, and thank you for making that delicious bread. And yeah, we will talking again in a week. So thank you all for zooming in. Thank you, Justin, for coming out. And anything else you want to say before we hop off here?
No, I just want to say it was a pleasure to bake in the oven again, as always. And come, please, people, come out to Stratford Hall and visit, see this kitchen. It's unbelievable. It's the most fantastic kitchen of any historic home in America. It really is. Once you see it, you can.
I agree. Yes, Justin.
Really see, you can see the history in it, and it kind of it gives me chills. I know when I start the fire in there to think who ate this bread that was made in there? Who ate these things? It's just phenomenal.
Who lit that fire every day for hundreds of years and kept it going? Stratford is magical. I'm so happy that you just said that, because I agree completely. I live 3.5 hours away from Stratford Hall, and I work here because this place has the potential to really tell the history of America in every way possible. So
it does. It does.
I love your support. All right, awesome, Justin. We'll see you all next week. We'll see you again, Justin, next week. And thank you all for zooming in, and sign up if you haven't yet for next week's program. And we'll see you in 7 days.
All right. Sounds good.
Good night, everybody. Thanks, Justin.